Hello and welcome to this GRUSFI panel on central banks and regulators. My name is Uli Volz. I'm a professor of economics at SOAS, University of London, where I also direct the Center for Sustainable Finance. I will be your moderator for today. We have 75 minutes and we have 5 excellent panelists, 4 of which are central bankers and supervisors, and 1 colleague is from academia. I'll introduce them in a moment when I invite them to make some introductory remarks. The plan is as follows. I'll just very briefly set the scene, and then I will invite each of our panelists to make some brief opening remarks of no longer than 5 minutes. We'll then have an open discussion among the panel, and we will also take questions from the audience. There is a Q&A function on this conference platform, so please make use of that, and I will try to keep an eye on this and pick up questions as they fit into the discussion. So, we're going to look at what central banks and supervisors have been doing in the space of sustainable finance and investment, how they have been responding to the climate crisis, but also how they are starting to look at other sustainability risks, such as biodiversity risk. And a couple of years ago, this was a very niche discussion. Now it has really gone mainstream. The network of central banks and financial supervisors for greening the financial system has now more than 100 members, with all the major central banks and financial supervisors from around the world being members and being very engaged in this question of how they should tackle the very serious sustainability problems we are facing. And so the discussion is developing very rapidly. So it's great to have this opportunity today to take stock. Where are we? What has happened? But also, and maybe more importantly, to discuss what are the major issues, what are the major challenges in moving this agenda forward to make sure that central banks and supervisors are really doing what they need to do to safeguard the financial system from all kinds of sustainability risk, but also what they could and should be doing to support the mainstreaming of sustainable finance. So how to align the financial system with sustainability so that the financial sector really becomes part of the solution in addressing the climate crisis and other sustainability problems, and is not part of the problem. So it gives me great pleasure to have these 5 wonderful colleagues with me today. They're all thought leaders in their institutions and in academia. And so I will invite each of them to make some brief opening remarks of no longer than 5 minutes. And first, I would very much like to invite Mariana Escobar Uribe from Colombia, who is head of sustainable finance at the Superintendencia Financiera de Colombia. I apologize for my not that great Spanish. Mariana, it's great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oli, and thanks for this invitation. I think at the SFC, we have been working for the past 2-3 years on a sustainable finance strategy for an emerging market like ours. Talking about sustainability, not just climate, is really, really important. So since the beginning, we have been considering many issues beyond climate change. However, when we started working at the superintendencia, not necessarily as a market level strategy, but at the or market level awareness, but at the superintendencia, in the first phase of our of our strategy, we focused on climate change because we wanted to move forward the market into these new discussions. No, what we saw in the superintendency is the market has been aware of the climate and social, environmental and social issues, for quite some time, especially the banks. They have been developing their ESRM systems. They've been issuing their own green bonds. However, they weren't up to date in the discussions regarding physical and transition risks. So we developed a strategy. The strategy was focused on four main objectives. We focused on, we wanted to do two things. We wanted to facilitate capital mobilization, but we also wanted to promote ESG and climate risk management, proper ESG and climate risk management. So we focus on four things on that first phase: promoting innovation on green instruments, improving transparency, either via taxonomies for those green instruments or under the disclosure regimes, since we also supervise capital market participants. Developing regulatory and supervisory tools. So we developed for the first time good practices guidance on ESG integration, climate risk, ESG and climate risk integration for institutional investors. And we also started doing our own climate risk assessments internally to try to understand these new tools, supervisory tools. And finally, building skills and capabilities. So for this first phase, we started mobilizing different actors to do taxonomy. We are developing or issuing our own disclosure regulation, very much aligned with the TCFD principles, but actually not focusing the scope is not just focused on climate. We're going to touch upon all other ESG issues. Develop a green bond guidance, and as I said before, ESG integration guidance for institutional investors. And we are soon to publish our first vulnerability analysis for banks regarding physical and transition risks. For the future, we still need to close some gaps regarding capacity, knowledge, and skills in the superintendency, but in the market. We also need to improve awareness of these issues. They have, as I said before, they have been doing it traditionally more on the Ecuador principles perspective, responsible investment perspective, but not necessarily analyzing the impact that those issues is going to have on them, more on the impact they have on those issues. Obviously, and I think this is something that everybody's going to say, improving data availability, not only from the private sector or issuers or corporates, but also from the public sector. And kind of in the Colombian case, we need to level out the different practices within the different industries because there is a difference. So there's an heterogeneity in the way of their incorporating these issues. There's a difference between banks, institutional investors, and capital market participants. So for the next year, we're going to focus on these challenges that we have.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariana, for outlining quite ambitious agenda of the superintendencia. So let's move on to Morocco. Najwa Mahuri is lead of the Green Finance Unit at Bank Al Maghrib, and she has been working on sustainability issues now for quite some time, and in many ways, Bank Al Maghrib has been, I think, a leader in this field on the African continent. If you could please tell us a bit of what's been driving you most recently.
Thanks, Eli, for having me. Actually, at the Central Bank of Morocco, climate and broader environment-related risks management and green finance promotion, and especially sustainable finance promotion, has emerged as a priority for the Central Bank for a long time ago, especially since the COP22 that was actually hosted in Marrakesh, where the Central Bank has taken the lead in promoting sustainable finance through the implementation of a financial system-wide roadmap for sustainable finance. So internally, we have started since that time progressively building our overall approach, but also strategy towards supervising and managing these risks, but also towards promoting green finance among banking institutions that fall under our supervisory remit, actually. So we have started an early engagement with the national stakeholders as part of the large combined effort demonstrated through the implementation of the roadmap, but also early engaging with the banking sector to raise climate and environment-related risks awareness, but also build their capacities and disseminate international best practices. So this approach, actually, this internal approach followed an evolving learning curve, since this issue is a new and emerging one. So we have also set up an internal structure dedicated to green finance within the banking supervision department. And we have started to closely follow an international work, but also contributing to international work on green and inclusive green finance. As we are a member of the NGFS and the Alliance for Financial Inclusion, but also of the Sustainable Banking Network. After this first phase, led by voluntary actions from the banking institutions, but also from the financial system following the national roadmap, we have recently issued early this year a regulatory guidance, which is actually setting expectations for banking institutions on how to manage the financial risks stemming from climate change, but also from environmental decline, especially through governance, disclosure, scenario analysis, but also risk management frameworks. So we are also being supported by the World Bank on a 2 years working program, which aims to perform the first assessment exercise of climate-related risks in the banking sector. But also it should inform and frame the design of further regulatory developments in terms of in terms of reporting, but also scenario analysis. This program aims also to train internal staff of the central bank, but also the banking sector and the broader financial system to on how to best implement the guidelines that are issued and should be issued in the near future by the central bank. Maybe just some few words regarding the next steps forward and the main initiatives that we're planning to implement. We're actually mindful of the need to better understand the financial risks stemming from climate change and environmental decline, to properly supervise the banking sector, but also to make sure that banking institutions are effectively implementing the supervisory expectations we have recently issued. So capacity building is actually at the forefront of our agenda. We are also keenly aware of the need to develop green markets in Morocco, but also attract the necessary investment to manage climate and environment-related risks and take the necessary action. So we're actually planning to conduct a study of green banking trends that would help us to identify the key challenges that banks are facing that may prevent them from further providing green financing, but also to identify the key levers that could possibly scale up climate action and environmental sustainability, but also their related financing opportunities and action that could potentially trigger mitigation actions from the banking institutions to reduce their exposures to climate and environment related risks.
Thank you so much, Najwa. As you said, quite ambitious an agenda. Also, I think very interesting to hear that, just like Mariana, you were also emphasizing very much the need for capacity building, both internally within your institution, but also in the financial system at large. So I'd like to invite now Yi Fei, from the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission. He's a senior inspectorate advisor of the Policy Research Bureau. And Yan Fei, China has been really at the forefront of addressing climate environmental risks. Actually, your own institution, or the kind of predecessor, the China Banking Regulatory Commission, already back in 2007 issued a green credit policy, but so much has happened since then. So I'm keen to hear what you and colleagues are up to now. What are your plans? Yan Fei, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, you haven't opened the video for me, Professor?
Yeah, the video your video is off right now. I don't know how that could be changed.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay, it's good now. So thank you, Professor. Thanks for having me, and it's my great honor to have some dialogue or talks with academia and with the counterparts of the other countries' regulators or central bank. Yes, we have done a lot in green finance. As you mentioned, as early as 2007, we have issued our first guidelines on promoting emission reduction and energy saving by the lending activities of banks and other banking institutions. That's the version 1, I should say. And then in 2012, CBIRC issued is the second version of the green credit policy, which is called green credit guidelines. Now we are going to issue our third version of the green guidelines. This time, we would like to enhance these guidelines into some kind of a regulation, so that the banks have to comply with the guideline, with the new document. And also this new document will cover the both banking sectors and insurance sectors. This is the latest, one of the latest progress. The second one is that we are going to establish some kind of green insurance statistics for the banking states, green banking statistics or green credit statistics. We established it in 2013. Last year, we have revised our statistical system for the green credit. Especially, we set as a subset for the climate finance. For the future, we are going to set another subset for the blue finance or marine related finance. So on our statistics, green finance statistics, the biggest one is the green finance by the banks, about banking institutions. So there's one subset is for the climate finance. In the future, we will have a second set for the second subset for the blue finance. And for the future, we're going to establish the green insurance statistics. That's the second progress. The third progress, we are going to formulate some kind of disclosure guidelines for the banks and insurance, so that they could disclose their green finance information in a standardized way, which is set up by the regulator. That's the major progress in three major progress in green finance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yan-Fei. Just one quick question on the disclosure that you just mentioned. Will this be a mandatory disclosure on these green finance activities, or voluntary?
Voluntary is some kind of guidelines which combine the good practice put a good practice in the guidelines, and then the bank can follow these guidelines. But you see, the guidelines issued by regulator, normally the bank have to comply with. So we should not say they should comply, but in practice, in most cases, they would like to comply with. Because if there's some problem, we can accuse them. We have provided some good practice. Why not you follow that? Yeah.
All right, that's good. So it is kind of binding. Great, thank you. Then I would like to invite Chris Faint, who's head of division and head of the Bank of England's Climate Hub, to give us his intro remarks. The Bank of England now also has been a pioneer. It has very much, just like the People's Bank of China and CBRC, set the scene for the trend we've seen emerging over the last years, with more and more central banks and supervisors working on climate and other issues. So great, Chris, to hear from you what the latest thinking at the bank is, and also where you see the major challenges.
Thanks, Uli, and thank you for the invite here today. So as you said, the Bank of England has been talking about climate issues for some time, and it is incredible just how much the agenda has changed over that time. Well, where even 4 years ago, we spent most of our time stacking up the case for why climate risks arose from climate change and thinking about the microprudential areas predominantly. The agenda has just exploded to cover off markets, macroeconomic areas, a number of different areas. And that is fantastic because it has created an extra level of debate and an extra level of momentum. In terms of the key things that the Bank of England has done over that time, I'll bring out a few. The first one is that we were really keen to drive performance, drive an understanding of risk in the institutions that we supervise. So we set some supervisory expectations for how firms should be embedding climate risks in the work that they do, with a deadline to ambitiously embed it by the end of this year. So over the next 3 months, as we get towards the end of the year, and then at the beginning of next year, we'll be speaking to firms and assessing firms to understand how far they have got on that. We're running a system-wide stress test or scenario exercise with a relatively granular bottom-up approach to getting data to understand just how climate risks will arise and will develop over the next 30 years, and to build capabilities and capacity within firms. On disclosure, it's of course really important, and it's already been touched on in a couple of areas. As a central bank, we try to lead by example. So we have done our own TCFD disclosure, and we've tried to broaden that out to a number of the areas that we operate in. And just recently, we've been thinking about our own operations. So we've put out a consultation paper thinking about how we could green the process for bringing on board assets that are used for our market processes within the Bank of England. Now, there is a huge amount going on, and the agenda continues to march on and evolve. So that is giving rise to a number of issues. And what I thought I might do is just draw out 3 of them today. Now, these aren't the 3 most important issues, but I think they are quite important. The first one is an issue that's existed for a long time, but it's balancing the need for action in light of data. And that is really uncomfortable for anybody, but particularly for central bankers, because we like to have data to ground the decisions that we make, because the decisions that we make can have quite big implications for those in the economy that we are working in. So what we are doing both domestically and internationally is working to just try and close down data gaps, and also to figure out how we can use judgment and expertise to plug data gaps in the absence of having bottom-up data. That is, of course, going to be a process that takes some time to plug, but we are seeking to be courageous in how we do that in the short term, so we can actually deliver on results in terms of embedding risks. The second one is prioritization. As the agenda just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, new fronts are being opened. And particularly in areas such as biodiversity, we're seeing whole new areas of policy that we need to now explore. Now, this is, again, this is fantastic because these are areas that we need to be looking at. But where you only have a limited amount of resource, there is only a limited amount of work that you can do. And these are huge, huge topics. So I know within the Bank of England, but also certainly within all of our peers, we're having to carefully prioritize, think about what we can do domestically and think about where we should be acting internationally to ensure that we are getting the traction that we need. Because what is 100% sure is that we can't all tackle all of these issues independently because they are just too huge. And then the third issue that I'll draw out today is in light of the agenda becoming just so big, and given all of the developments that we're seeing in the green market space, we need to ensure that there's coherence across everything that we are doing. So to draw that out with some examples, we need to make sure that, you know, if we are doing work on the microprudential side and thinking through about how, say, risk weights might be impacted, we should have one eye to what's going on with taxonomies. And we should also be thinking through reporting standards and how an ecosystem of all these endeavors that are being developed can be aligned as far as possible. The risk is that if each of those isn't aligned, and I'm talking about internationally, but also domestically, it will become confusing for consumers, and I think we'll lose traction. But as a final word, I'll just say, but these are in some ways are quite nice issues to have. They're issues that arise from momentum in the marketplace and also in the discussion space on these issues. So I see it as a mark of a good thing, but it is something that we're going to have to address quite carefully over the coming period.
Thank you very much, Chris. Very clear and to the point. And I'm sure we'll get back to these three challenges that you raised in a moment. So last but not least, I'd like to invite Irene Monastarolo to give her opening remarks. She's currently an assistant professor of climate economics and finance at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. But she will actually, in exactly 1 month, assume a professorship at ETHEC Business School in France. And Irene has been really one of the leading thinkers in this climate risk space. And she's made some very important contributions, not just to the academic literature, but also to the practical discussions. And she's been working with various financial institutions on implementing her ideas. So great to hear from you, Irene, where you see the major challenges, what your assessment, your stock taking is. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Uli, for inviting me today. This very interesting panel and conversation. Well, I will try to take stock of the discussion so far, and in particular what has been raised by Naiwa and Chris to make the task of the researcher here, so to highlight what are the challenges for central banks, as well as the opportunities and how to exploit them. So on the one hand, Naiwa talked about climate risk assessment and a collaboration with the World Bank on scenario analysis. And on the other hand, Chris talked also about the importance of embedding climate risk in financial risk assessment. Well, this is crucial, and it's much connected to what I want to discuss today, which is the role and use of climate scenarios in climate financial risk assessment of central banks. So on the one hand, the Network for Green Financial System that you introduced before, Uli, has made a major effort to provide climate transition scenarios to be, which are provided by process-based integrated assessment models to support investors and financial authorities in their climate financial risk assessment, and in particular in climate stress test exercises. However, there is when we use scenarios for climate stress test, we need to be aware of what are the characteristics of the scenarios, their assumptions, because these are crucial then for in the estimates of risk. And what we want to be sure here this time is that being climate change such a global issue and systemic issue, we don't want to underestimate potential risk. So what are the issues with the scenarios as they are right now? The scenarios do not consider finance and its complexity, and thus they do not allow to analyze under which condition finance, and with finance we mean also policies that could be implemented by central banks and financial tools, can either enable or hinder the transition. And yet this is crucial, in particular to consider a major issue of climate-related financial risk, which is endogeneity. The endogeneity derives from the interplay between climate policy credibility and investors' expectations about risk across the potential trajectories that will occur. And this, however, this is important because it will affect the realization or not of the same climate scenario that we are considering. On the other hand, it could give rise to what already Mark Carney in 2015 highlighted is potential systemic risk implication. So in our recent paper published on Science, we really address this issue, looking at what can be done, how can we connect the two words of climate scenarios and embedding climate financial risk assessment in order to strengthen these scenarios and thus strengthen climate financial risk assessment. So actually what we did was to embed a climate financial module that is based on the climate stress test that we developed in 2017 that allows to adjust risk pricing by individual financial actors. Imagine the interest rate of loans for firms depending, right, as Chris said before, on the level of greenness or brownness or dirtiness, sorry, of the economic activity, conditioned to each climate scenario of the NGFS. And then we fed this adjusted risk into a risk metric in the NGFS trajectories. And the results are very interesting because they highlight different feasibility of an orderly or a disorderly transition, which are the most relevant for central banks, depending on whether investors play an enabling or hindering role. So with an orderly transition, the NGFS has identified a transition where climate policies such as carbon tax are implemented early in a stable way, while disorderly transition means transition when climate policies are introduced late and in a sudden way, and as investors cannot fully anticipate them. Well, what we show with this enhanced climate scenarios is that if you have an orderly transition and you, central bank, think that you are going to get on the path of the orderly transition, but investors don't trust the policy introduction in 2030 and thus play an hindering role, you actually turn into a disorderly transition scenario. In contrast, while the introduction of the policy could work as a disorderly transition scenario, but investors anticipate the introduction of the policy or have climate sentiments, actually what happens is that the scenario of transition could be smoothed, right, because of the enabling role of finance, and you could get much closer to an orderly transition. Thus, what what does it mean? It means that considering finance and its complexity in relation to the scenarios is crucial to then be able to better integrate orderly, disorderly transition in financial risk assessment, and of course to design policies when you are central bank or financial regulator to mitigate, to actually address such risk and preserve financial stability.
Thank you very much, Irene. And I'd like to invite all of you to switch on your cameras so that we can see each other. And when moving now to the open discussion. So, Irene, I think you very nicely described the complexities and hinted at some of the shortcomings in the current scenario analysis, which, I mean, is still rapidly developing. But I would like to actually draw on the first point that Chris made, or kind of the first challenge that he highlighted to discuss with you. So Chris said central bank supervisors need to balance the urgent need for action. I've added the urgent now, but Chris will probably agree, with a lack of data, or maybe also more broadly, kind of with still imperfect methodologies that we have. And now, if we look around at what's happening on an almost daily basis in terms of climate and natural disasters, it looks quite scary. So I think, and if we read, the latest science reports and so on, it gets even more scary. So there is this very urgent need to really address the climate problem, the biodiversity problem, and so on. And here are we now, and we're all perfectionists trying to get the right models running, the right data to feed them, and so on. But there is this risk that we will be working on our nice models for a long time and really not get the action going at the scale and speed that we need to. So I'd like to invite you to reflect a little bit more on this, and because if we put it differently in terms of Greta Thunberg would say the house is on fire, and we're still trying to collect our data. What are we going to do? I don't know who would like to go first.
I'm happy to go first on that one. So I mean, this discussion about scenarios is critical, I think, but it's really important to consider what scenarios are actually for, and what these exercises are designed to do. To our mind at the Bank of England, that they're not designed to come out with an answer, a clear numeric answer that can then be plugged into something and give rise to specific policy actions. What the scenarios are designed to do is to almost kind of bookend the way that you can think about issues, which allows you to have a discussion about the kind of policies that might be required. And we do recognize that in doing this, we might be using scenarios that are understating the types of risks that will come at us. In fact, we're almost certainly understating the types of risks that are coming at us. But it is the best tool that we have at the moment to run those kind of thought exercises. So, I mean, I think to your point about some of the shortfalls of scenarios, I 100% agree. We are not using scenarios at the moment that look at all risks. And as a result, I do think there will be understating the types of risks. So for that reason, it's really, really important that when we run scenario analysis, we do a couple of things. The first thing is that we are just totally transparent, and we say, look, these are the tools that we're using. these are the areas where we think there might be some understatement of risks. And these are the areas where we think actually it might be a better indication. And then the second thing we should be doing is when we're using those results, we should be flexing the way that we consider those results in the outcomes that we are then determining. So as an example, for the scenario exercise that we're undertaking in the UK, we are not going to be setting capital requirements for banks and insurers on the back of this exercise in a mechanical way, because we just said we can't. It's not appropriate. It's an exploratory exercise, and all of these tools are just too early in their creation to do that. But what we will do is we'll look at the results. We'll look at the shape of the risks that are coming through those results, and we will take that back and we'll think, well, should there be any policy thinking that we start to think about and we develop on the back of this? And going forwards, as scenarios get ever deeper and broader, how can we use those scenarios to eventually have a more direct link between the actions that we take and the exercises that we run? So I totally agree with everything that you've said, Irene, but in the absence of better tools, I think we need to use the tools that we have at the moment, but with the appropriate caveats.
Maybe, Uli, I can add. Yeah, of course. So it doesn't mean that you don't need to use these scenarios. Well, that's also the reason why we spent kind of 1 year of work to try to improve the scenarios. And indeed, the reason why we realized it only in it was a learning by doing process. We started to use the integrated assessment model scenarios in 2016 now for a climate stress test. So the point is, since these scenarios are then, central banks are inviting investors to use these scenarios for the climate stress test, and being a climate such a systemic risk, we might not risk to underestimate it or to be very wrong on climate stress test exercises, as it sometimes happened in the wake of the last financial crisis. It's important that we strengthen this tool, because scenario analysis, as also Naiwa said before, is incredibly important tool for climate stress test. But there is, as science is going forward, also research and policy relevant research is going forward and can contribute to this debate. And the debate, as Uli said before, what do we do with data? Well, in this context, data, metrics, and methods should be considered as a public good and should be fully transparent and accessible. So this is a major point that I would really like central banks and financial regulators to take on.
Thank you. Just as you also mentioned, data. Obviously, data is always mentioned as a major shortcoming. Now, central banks and supervisors actually do have in their power to demand wider disclosure. And indeed, there's now a growing chorus of senior central bankers, and certainly Mark Carney has been emphasizing that now for quite some while, that we really should be having mandatory disclosure, for example, using the TCFD framework. Why are we so slow on that?
I can answer from an emerging market perspective, because I think it changes greatly between a developed market and an emerging market. In our case, there are two things. First, you have to, as a supervisor, in my case, we have to be very careful with the measures we impose in the market. Our markets are very small, and you don't want to create a barrier for new entrants. So you have to balance the cost of not having the information with the cost of asking the information, and the need for you to align the market to international discussion standards. So it's a very complex balance. And to be honest, from the work we have been doing at the Superintendencia, to me, the disclosure component has been one of the biggest kind of regulatory challenge, philosophical challenge, because that balance is not easy. That's the first point. The second point is that you have to prepare the market. I know climate change is an urgent matter, but we also have like a responsibility. In the case of the Superintendencia, we do have a little bit of, or we've been trying for many years to develop in the market as well. So you have to sign the appropriate signals before you start with the regulation. You have to prepare them. You have to build capacity in the market, but also with the supervisors, and that cannot happen overnight. So it has to be a process for us to impose and to develop a disclosure regime. We did have to start from making a diagnostic, an assessment on where we were at, what are international investors demanding, what are the needs we're going to have as supervisors regarding data to conduct certain analysis, and then publish and develop a regulatory regime. So from emerging markets, I think the barriers are around capacity and market size. Like you have to understand the context in order to be successful. If you become very abrupt, what you're going to have is resistance, and you're not going to have the proper disclosure anyways. So
thank you. I see Najwa nodding very supportively. Do you want to chip in?
Yes, I totally agree with you, Ali. We need to bridge the data gaps, which is mostly relevant in the context of developing and emerging countries. I cannot speak about the limitations of scenario analysis since it is the next step forward at this stage for Bank Al Maghrib. But we are also facing data challenges as these climate-related data hasn't been captured in the past. But as a first step, we have set some supervisory expectations, and banks are called to disclose their practices as regards climate and environment-related risks management following the TCFD standards. But I totally agree with Mariana regarding the need to implement a gradual and progressive approach in implementing in applying and implementing such expectations. So we have introduced an article in our supervisory guidance which stipulates a gradual implementation just to steer the banking industry's efforts, not staying in a lack of action, because we are mindful that we need to, that access to data finance need to be scaled up at a much faster rate in Morocco alongside strengthened capacities. So we want to give the banks sufficient time to disclose their practices, but we have started by setting some preliminary expectations regarding disclosures. I think that challenges lie also in further development in financial policy and regulation regarding climate and broader environment-related risks disclosures to improve transparency about these risks, and design also plausible climate scenarios. And regarding this point, I wanted to point out that in the context of emerging and developing countries, it is even more challenging in the work of when it comes to translating climate or environment-related risks into finance-related ones. So there is a need of closer collaboration between scientific economic modeling communities and the investment community in the work of translating the decarbonization pathways or transition pathways into finance-related impacts. And I think this picks up on what Irene has said earlier.
Thank you. Please, Jan-Fei.
Yeah, yes, thank you. So the lack of data is the concern of regulators and also the concern of the banks. But this problem will be solved in China gradually. This year, China has begun its emission trading program, which covers only one sector, that is coal-fired power sector. It accounted for about 40% of the total carbon emission of China. So that means each coal-fired plant would have to submit their emission data to the Ministry of Environmental Protection, now called the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. So that means this data could possibly be shared by the banks if it is agreed by that ministry. And for the next year, an additional 3 sectors like iron and steel and cement and the chemicals would be covered by this emission trading program. That these 4 sectors will account for about 60% of China's emission, carbon emission. So that means the companies in these sectors would have very sound emission data because this is certified by the third party entrusted by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. And banks in their lending activities, they also can ask their clients to report this emission data to the banks so that they can improve their lending decisions. The other way is that individually, I ask some banks to collect some volume data relating to the usage of energy, relating to the usage of water, and so on. So that through this kind of a volume data, the bank can guess or estimate the emission of their clients. Then they could find out which company has a better energy efficiency or carbon efficiency than others. Then they can take this into their decision maker and to extend more lendings to those have very efficient, carbon efficient factories, and make some restrictions of lendings to those with low carbon efficiency plants or companies. So the data could be solved gradually. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Yan-Fei. I'd like to bring in a question from the audience that also is very much linked to this discussion. It's a question from Professor Olaf Weber. He says, we all know what indicators should be used to supervise climate-related risks, such as those mentioned by TCFD and other standards. Why do central banks not just start to assess these indicators? We can continue to develop scenarios anyway. And a second question also related, and this is specifically addressed at Chris. This is a question from Nathan de Ariba-Sellier, who says, I understand, Chris, but we know the shape of the risks. The IPCC was very clear the next decade will push us beyond 1.5 centigrade, while IEA warned against opening new fossil fuel extraction sites. Why not using capital requirements for that already?
Should I take that second question?
Please, and anyone else who wants to chip in.
Yeah, so the question of whether you should be capitalizing against climate risks is it's a live one. It's been looked at by a number of different organizations, including us. The capital structure that we have looks to capitalize for risks that happen that will crystallize 1 year to 3 years in the future, typically. Now, that is much shorter a time period than you would see the crystallization of most climate risks happening over. So one of the questions that policymakers are thinking about is that appropriate? Should you be capitalizing for risks that go beyond one to 3 years? Can you make a special, is there something special about climate that means that you should be moving away from that framework? Now, I say there's people on both sides of the argument. Those that say that capital is the right tool, argue that climate is different. The nature of climate is that climate risks will just get incrementally larger each year. So there's a certainty around those risks, and as a result, that makes them unique, and that might mean that you should be capitalizing for those in a slightly different way. Those that argue against it say, well, the reason that the capital framework is calibrated as it is because within 1 to 3 years, institutions are able to move out of exposures that they have. And it is therefore appropriate to use different tools for risks beyond 3 years, such as making sure that they're held to account for their business, using markets and transparency to hold firms account for the kind of risks that they will be running. I don't think there's any institution yet that has said how they intend to capitalize against climate risks. But what we've said in the UK is at least for the short term, we want firms to demonstrate to us that they are comfortable that there's no material capital risks arising from climate in the short term. So it's be creative and prove to us, demonstrate to us that you've thought about these risks. But as we internationally have this debate, particularly in places like Basel, I think you'll see more and more discussion on this specific topic. It's definitely one that we need to bottom out in the short to medium term.
Thanks, Chris. If I may just follow up on this. So there's now a discussion around demanding financial institutions to lay out net zero transition plans. What would you think about instruments like that? So with my supervisor hat on, I would be concerned if firms don't have an understanding of how risks will arise over time and a plan for how they intend to transition in light of those risks. If there is a transition plan, I would be concerned if there were too many assumptions baked into that transition plan that looked a bit shaky. So if a firm was to say, we're going to get out of all of these exposures, at the same time that all of their peers would be seeking to get out of those exposures, you could argue that's too optimistic, or if they're putting too much reliance upon technological changes. So I think it's, of course, positive if firms have a transition plan. It shows that they're thinking strategically about the issue. But what I, as a supervisor, would want to understand is how the risks are likely to arise through that transition, and how much optimism is baked into that. And that is going to be considerations like this are going to be part of the discussion that we have with our firms over the coming period. I think we've lost Uli, but I don't know if anybody else wanted to comment on climate and capital in his absence.
I just say some words on this issue. Well, for the regulator, I guess it's very difficult for us to have some very complete and good transition plan for the banks or for the other financial institutions. Yeah. It must be done by the bank themselves and financial institutions themselves. In China, the central government has set some goals. For example, before the 2030, China's the renewable energy would account for 25% of the total energy of China. So that means renewable energy sector would have a lot of growth. So that means some coal-fired power plant will have to be phased out in the future. So then the banks can make their decisions following the central government's goal. The other goal is that for the electric car. According to China's central government's plan, before the 2025, 1/5 of the cars would be electric cars. That means the electric cars, this sector would have lots of growth. Gasoline cars will not so popular in the future, would not be so popular in the future. So the banks, based on the central government's goal, then they make their lending decisions. So I guess the transition would be orderly if a central government has a goal, and if this goal could be achieved in orderly way, then the banks can have some smooth transition, and they can have some smooth phase out from the carbon intensive assets into the low carbon assets. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Well, this is a very important point that was recently analyzed also by research, and it's it's fundamental to have long-term policy, incredible policy in place to allow investors to price the implications of such policies in the risk management strategy. So this is, I think, a very, very important point. It seems that we have, it seems that we have a few seconds to go. So if you want to have a last say, it's now.
If I might just add something. So I think we have 15 minutes. So,
okay.
So
I saw a warning, a strange warning. Please
so
wrap up. Okay.
So Ulrich seems to have been cut off. So I've asked to ask some questions from the audience by the tech guys behind the scenes. So a question that's been raised is: the central bank plays role both as a regulator investor through FX reserves. On the latter, please share if there's a change to your asset allocation after implementing sustainability approaches. So I guess this is speaking to another live debate across central banks about whether they should be looking at climate risks and other climate considerations in the assets that they hold. I don't know if others want to comment on that. If not, I would be happy to comment on that from a Bank of England perspective. So we actually our corporate holdings at the Bank of England are relatively small as a whole of when you look at all of our assets. It's only about 1%, but we do recognise that it's important that we do recognise climate risks when we're thinking about what assets we purchase. So what we've put out is a consultation paper saying, look, this is really complex, because as a central bank, we need to make sure that we maintain market neutrality for when we're implementing monetary policy tools. But we also need to recognize that the market is potentially not pricing climate risks at the moment. So what we've put out is a consultation paper that talks through 4 different ways that we can seek to, over time, understand the climate risks in the assets that we purchase. And one of the things that is really important in this is, to the previous point, looking at whether firms are publishing transition plans and publishing credible transition plans. And if they're not publishing transition plans, then the likelihood that they could be part of future Bank of England purchases will reduce. But this is a really tricky issue for central banks, and I know that other central banks are thinking through how this could work for them. And from Bank of England perspective, only 1% of our assets. I guess it's slightly easier for us to address than others like the ECB, who have a much greater corporate asset holding. I don't know if others have any comments on that.
Well, I think that the carbon intensive assets could be classified into two types. The one is like coal-fired plant or fossil sector. Sooner or later, they will be replaced by the renewable energies, renewable energy. So that means this kind of carbon-intensive sectors or industry will be phased out sooner or later. That means this assets sooner or later will become the stranded assets. So that will have some influence on the quality of financial assets and the financial stability. The other one, the other type of the carbon-intensive assets, like iron and steel, like chemicals. For this kind of sectors, there's no other industries or other materials can replace this old one. The only thing that could happen is to improve the technology to reduce the emission of these sectors. But these sectors will not disappear in the future. So that means the price of the product could be transmitted through the market can transmit it to the consumers or other investors. So for this kind of assets, the second type of assets, there will be no concern about the financial stability, because that's all to all the companies in these sectors. But the only one for the first type, like the coal-fired plant or fossil energy sector, there will be some problem. And also for the gasoline car sectors, maybe another one, because electric car will sooner or later replace the gasoline cars. Yeah. Those are my remarks. Thank you.
So hello. Apologies, I had some minor technical issues and nothing worked, but I trust you continued good discussion. So I don't feel positioned well to kind of guide the next question. So I don't know if any of you wanted to respond to whatever has been just said, so I can listen into, and we still have 7 minutes, so there's still a little bit of time.
Just about maybe I will go. So this point is really critical, because it's out to think about the transition in the sectors that will be affected by potentially affected by carbon stranded assets, and these actually, on the one hand, there will need. I will get back to the fact that we need to. Stable policy to understand where do we want to go and what do we want to be in terms of economy in the next 20 years, and to address the future of these industries, as actually he say, might not disappear. Some of them will inevitably, because we have to shrink drastically, according to the last IPCC report, the emissions. But some of these companies, at least in Europe, are diversifying their portfolio of activities and are investing in renewables. But for the others, we'll need to think of what to do, because there is either keeping them going might lead to the realization of stranded assets, and then addressing the cost of these firms too late. Then it will be all on government's hands, which means taxpayers' money and sovereign debt. And in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, I mean, central banks did already massive job to keep economies floating, and they might not be able to save also the companies from carbon stranded assets. So the point is to discuss how to, let's say, strengthen the use of fiscal and financial tools to allow a smooth transition in the real economy and to have the least negative impact on the market, considering the limits of physics and science that, for instance, the IPCC report highlighted.
I'm still a little bit lost because I dropped out before. We still have 5 minutes left. So I suppose we should be moving to a kind of a closing round, where maybe you could all very briefly highlight some key point that you want to take forward. So what's kind of the key issue that you want to move ahead or see the discussion move ahead on? And we may go again in the same order as we did with the intro round. So Mariana, if you'd like to go first, thank you.
Thank you, Uli. I think I'm gonna repeat something that I already said, because I saw a lot of the discussions from the perspective of a developed market, to be honest, like a lot of and sometimes it's very different, obviously, for I don't know, different stakeholders to understand how the challenges that an emerging market has in order to do this. So the first one, the last thing I wanted to say is that for us, at least at the Superintendencia, the way to approach these issues is in a gradual way. So the first thing we do is to understand what we have, what we can do. The second one is what we can do with what we have. So trying to understand what the market is at. And that's having discussions, employing surveys, and try to start having and introducing concepts and conversations that we need financial institutions to start having within their organizations. The second step is to understand and start exploring and experimenting with these new tools that for an emerging market, to be honest, is extremely challenging. We don't have the skill set in the market, for the talent in the market. Within the Superintendencia normally, or an institution, we have limited capacity and teams. And I guess in the case of the Superintendencia, we have an exclusive team. But when you talk with other regulatory or supervisory authorities in the region, they have a person that have other responsibilities. So and when you go and talk with the market, with the financial institutions, for them it's also a challenge. I mean, there is not enough talent, there is not enough capacity. So for us, it's something that has to be implemented in a gradual way, and it has to be done step by step.
Right, thank you, Najwa. 1 minute, please.
Thank you. I have mentioned some few next step forward in the intro. Just to complement these points, I would say that taxonomy is something that we're trying to explore and to implement in the near future to drive the offer and demand for green financing at the Moroccan level, because we have some offer and demand constraint linked to the lack of taxonomy, the lack of capacities to structure and develop eligible green projects. So this taxonomy would also serve us a lot as a central bank to maybe issue some new regulatory expectations on the basis of this taxonomy. We are also exploring how we could integrate climate and environment related considerations in the monetary policy framework, building on the recently issued report of the NGFS. So we're trying to study which of the 9 options that are highlighted in this report would fit the best in our existing framework, and especially given our mandate, but also our context of developing a developing country.
Thank you. I'd be tempted to ask you about dirty taxonomies, but I won't do so now. Jan-Fei, please.
Thank you. Normally, stress test of the financial sectors for their financial asset would be done based on the historic data. But for the climate-related risks. This way is not useful. I mean, the future will meet. The climate will meet in the future would never be met before. Would have never be met before. So, in this way, I hope that academia can design some very good model for the climate-related risk stress test, because we have to find some new way for the stress testing with those kind of climate-related risks. Yeah.
Thank you, Anfei. I think with Irene, we have one of the leading actors on forward-looking climate risk modeling with us, actually. Chris, you emphasize the difficulty of getting the prioritization right. What is your priority?
What is my priority? So at the moment, our priority is looking at climate before the broader environmental and biodiversity debate, just because we think climate is such a grade A issue. Not to say that biodiversity isn't, but we think it requires a lot of focus at the moment to get us to a place where we understand climate and a lot of investment. So that is where our focus is at the moment. I think also internationally, there is just so much going on. There's so much scenario analysis exercises happening. There's so much development of things such as taxonomies. This is fantastic, but I do think we have an opportunity over the coming period to just try and align around certain frameworks, to not have too confusing an environment where we have 20 different versions of everything. That's going to be really, really hard for us to do, because every country has its own, every organization has its own priors. But I do think over the next 3 to 5 years, it will be really important that we try our very best to be as efficient as possible. Otherwise, it will not be helpful to the markets. And if it's not helpful to the markets, it won't be helpful to the transition. So I think there's an opportunity there for us.
I think that's a very good point. But I think we also need to make sure that we adopt the right frameworks, because otherwise we'll end up in trouble as well. Irene.
Well, I couldn't agree more on what you said, and indeed, so maybe just to reassure Yanfei that this is indeed the issue that has been discussed in research. Also with Uli, we published a report for the G20 T20 last year on the importance of using forward-looking climate scenarios for climate stress tests. And this is, in my small word, at least what I contributed to launching the climate stress test in 2017, which was indeed the first time that we used integrated assessment models, forward-looking scenarios that now are used by the NGFS regularly in a network-based stress test framework. The other point, then I will move to what I would like to see from central banks. Actually, they are doing already so much on this point if we compare it with other institutions. So, but my main desire would be that indeed, as Chris said, coming up with a standardized framework, and on the other hand, say something about dirt asset, because on the one hand, the the EU taxonomy of sustainable activities could help identify what are sustainable investments, but we also need to identify the shades of dirty, and this will be very difficult for several reasons, but this is big desire.
Thank you. I think that's a super important point, and we always like to talk about scaling up sustainable finance, but at least as important is really curtailing the flows of finance into the areas that are really dooming our common future. Well, I think we could go on. There's a lot of other issues that we really should be discussing, but time unfortunately is up. So thank you all very much. I think it's been a great picture to see, what's already happening. But I think there's also, it should be also clear that there is a really important role in kind of shaping how the market develops for central banks and supervisors. So I think there is a very important role for giving some clear signals and guidance. And as Chris said, we don't want to overcomplicate it, but I think leadership is important from your institutions, and I think we're lucky to have people like you in place. And I hope together we can move the agenda forward. And certainly academia is now very also active in trying to develop solutions. And I think a more interaction between policy and research can only help this. So let me thank you very, very much. Apologies again for my technical glitches in between, but well, such is life. And I look forward to many more interesting sessions in this GRUSFI conference. And if you can, please join. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.